Let me tell you that I, as well as Colin Mason, who has just raised his hand, who is standing by the camera there, we're both in China not very many months ago investigating ourselves the one-child policy. We went to various parts of China, North China and South China, and gathered evidence of not only the brutality and continuing brutality of China's one-child policy, but also of the United Nations Population Fund's involvement in that policy. And I just I could tell you stories about the policy, but many stories about the policy, but let me limit myself just to one. There was a young woman who was pregnant with her third child that I talked to while I was in China. And this pregnancy was going well because she was in a safe house, being given sanctuary, protected from the population control authorities, the state authorities who were looking for her. And she successfully went on to give birth and reintegrate into society. But when she was pregnant with her second child, things turned out very differently. When her pregnancy was discovered by the population control police, when she was about 4.5 months pregnant. You know, pregnancy isn't the sort of thing you can hide forever. A lot of Chinese women disguise their pregnancies for 3 or 4 or 5 months, but then they begin to show, and then they begin to, alert the authorities. So she was discovered to be pregnant by the population control police, who ordered her to come in for an abortion. Well, she didn't go in for that abortion. Instead, she did something that's known in China as childbirth on the run. She went to a cousin's house in a neighboring town and hid herself there for the next 4 months until she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. And if any of you have ever read books like Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place, or any of the stories of Christians giving sanctuary to Jews under the Nazi persecution, you'll understand the kind of thing that happens in China today, where women who are pregnant are hidden by friends and relatives or by believers from the authorities until they give birth. So she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, but realized that she could not go back to the town she was from with the little boy in arms, because there would be punishment, there would be consequences. And so, leaving her baby in the care of her cousin, she went back home. On the way, she stopped at an abortion clinic. And I say an abortion clinic, but a lot of medical clinics in China, all the government-run ones, do abortions. So she stopped at this abortion clinic, talked to the doctor in charge, and bribed him, gave him a small amount of money for the corpse of a full-term baby boy, a baby girl who'd been aborted the day before. And taking this corpse in her arms, she went back home to her town. And it wasn't long after she got home that the population control police came knocking on the door, because they had been looking for her for a long time and had heard she had returned. And she opened the door holding the body of this dead baby girl in her arms. Didn't say a word. And the population control police there looked at her, looked at the baby, and said, "Your baby died." And she still didn't say a word. But they went away happy because their mission had been accomplished. They believed, at least, that they had prevented the birth of a quote-unquote illegal child, and that they had themselves avoided official punishment for allowing the birth of a quote-unquote illegal child. So those are the lengths that people in China sometimes have to go to bring a baby into the world. But let's step back a little bit and ask ourselves, are these population control programs, which are obviously morally barbarous, they're morally abhorrent, is there any justification for them? I mean, is the world overpopulated? Is China overpopulated? Is there a food shortage? Is there a food shortage in China? Is there a global food shortage? Is there any economic justification for these policies? At this point, I'd like to play a short, in fact, a series of short YouTube videos. We'll do them one at a time, and we'll comment in between, that we've been working on for the past year at PRI, just to make it clear to people that overpopulation is a myth, that there's room on God's green earth for all of us, and that efforts to reduce human numbers by state-run population control programs are not only cause human rights violations, but also violate the right of parents, the God-given right of parents to decide for themselves the number and spacing of their children. This is not something that government should be in the business of deciding. This is something that is an individual right, is the right of the couple. So let's play, I think you've got 4 of them there. Let's play the first one. So what do you think about that? We have more. But let's talk about that for a minute, because I'm sure that all of you, probably beginning in social studies in 5th grade, have been taught over and over again that the world is overpopulated, or soon will be. And you've seen charts that show human population going up and up and up with no end in sight. That's not the reality. The reality today is that you've got, for example, all of Europe is below replacement rate fertility. That means in Europe, all the way from Ireland in the west to European Russia in the east, are having too few children to replace the current population. You've got 15 countries in Europe which are actually dying each year. By dying, I mean they're filling more coffins than cradles. Filling more coffins than cradles. More people are dying in those countries than are being born. And so the population is actually shrinking. So you have things like, you know, the hospitals in Germany, for example, are closing down maternity wards because there's no money to be made in birthing babies if there are no babies to be born, and opening up, you know, geriatric wards. You've got clothes factories that make clothes for kids closing down, and you've got cemeteries opening up. So, you know, it's a sad thing. Europe is, I like Europe, you know, I've traveled through France and Germany and Italy, but if the French and the Germans and the Italians don't start having children, someone else is going to inherit their countries in the future. And it won't be their descendants because they're not having enough. You know, it takes 2.1 children on average for every couple to maintain the current population. We'll get to that in a minute. So what's going to happen in Europe is an increasing decline in the number of people. We're actually going, PRI is going to Russia in late June. Colin will be going with us to film a show about dying Russia. You know, the power behind the throne in Russia, Vladimir Putin, the former president, declared 5 years ago that Russia was in the middle of a demographic crisis, a demographic catastrophe. And Russia is dying. Russia is losing 750,000 people each year. And so in 50 years, there will be a lot fewer Russians alive today than there are today. And a lot fewer Germans, and a lot fewer French, and a lot fewer Italians, and a lot fewer Spaniards, and so forth. You might think that Latin America is you know, still a continent of large families. That's not true either. Most Latin American countries are now having just enough children to replace the current population. Mexico, for example, the Mexican women, young Mexican women now are going to average only about 1.8 children over their reproductive lifetime. So they're below replacement rate fertility. This happened very suddenly, relatively speaking. In 1960, the average Mexican woman had 6 children. Today, she's going to average less than 2. That's true in Argentina, it's true in Brazil, it's true in most Latin American countries. Those countries that are still in Latin America above replacement aren't very far above replacement, and their birth rate is falling rapidly. Asia is below replacement. We've talked about China. Because of the one-child policy, in China, the Chinese are only averaging about 1.5 children. You might say 1.5, they should only have 1. Well, the people in the cities are only allowed 1. In the countryside, you're allowed a 2nd child in China if your first child is a girl. There's an exception made for people living in the countryside. Why? Because once the one-child policy was introduced 30 years ago, a lot of couples decided that they were going to make sure that their only child was going to be a boy. And so they began selectively eliminating little girls. And in the area of China I studied in 1979 and 1980, they would keep a bucket of water beside the bed where the woman was in labor. And if a little girl was born, they'd plunge her into the bucket of water before she had a chance to draw her first breath. They would drown her. If it was a little boy, of course, they would obviously let him live. So they were committing female infanticide back in 1980. Millions of little girls have been abandoned by the sides of roads in China. And for the last 25 years, may have been mentioned earlier, ultrasound machines have meant that sex-selective abortion is very common in China today. It's not just China, it's India as well. There are 80 million or so missing baby girls in India. Vietnam, Korea. Korea also has sex-selective abortion. Wherever you have a preference for sons, in combination with a population control program, you see sex-selective abortion in a big way. India has a 2-child policy. Even South Korea has a 2-child policy. If you're a government official in South Korea, you have more than 2 children, your career is over because of the 2-child policy limits. So you've got that problem throughout Asia. And birth rates are falling in Asia. I mean, India, one of the ugly poster children of overpopulation, is now Indian women are only averaging about 2.3 children, which in the case of India, because it's still a developing country with fairly high infant mortality rates, that's about replacement. That's about the number of children you need to be born to maintain the current population. The only continent in the world where you still have robust fertility is Africa. But Africa has another problem. Sub-Saharan Africa has the scourge of AIDS, with tens of millions of people infected. Almost all of whom will die within the next few years. It doesn't take long for AIDS to run its course in Africa, where immune systems are already under stress from polluted drinking water, from the lack of wastewater treatment facilities, from the endemic malaria, typhus, typhoid, the other tropical diseases. If your immune system is already compromised, AIDS takes you fairly quickly. So even in Africa, you still have very high death rates. If you're worried about people having too many children, what you do is you reduce the infant and child mortality rate. Because if people see more of their children surviving to adulthood, generally they have fewer children. In historical China, where probably half kids died before the age of 5, couples averaged 6 children because they wanted 2 or 3 children to survive to adulthood. If most children survive to adulthood, most couples will stop at 2 or 3 children. So you don't eliminate poverty by eliminating the poor. You don't force economic development by forcing down the birth rate, and yet that's exactly what China has tried to do. That's exactly what we in our foreign aid policy have tried to do for the last 40 years. Let's watch another video, the number 2 in the series. So you might think that final scene is a little bit exaggerated, but we had a war a few years ago in a place called Kosovo, which was originally part of Yugoslavia and was the traditional homeland of the Serbians. And in 1890, 90% of the people in Kosovo were Serbian, and only 10% were what are called Kosovars, who were Muslim Albanians from the country next door. But because the Serbians were only averaging about 1.5 children, and the Kosovars, the Muslim Albanians, were averaging 3, over the course of the next 100 years, the whole demography of the country switched until by the early 1990s, Kosovo was 90% Kosovar, that is 90% Albanian, and only that Serbs had been reduced to 10% of the population. And you know the rest of the story. Serbia tried to assert its rights over Kosovo, saying this is our traditional homeland, and the Kosovars said, no, you gave it up when you refused to have enough children to populate it, and it's our country now, and it's an independent country. So it doesn't take long for these demographic reversals to take place, just a couple of generations. You saw Japan illustrated there. Japan is dying. You know, we thought 20 years ago that there was a book written by a colleague of mine at Harvard called Japan is Number One. Ezra Vogel wrote that book, and today we know that Japan will never be number 1 because the number of Japanese has peaked at about 126 million, and Japan is now shrinking. And before a country shrinks in population, it ages. Everybody gets older and older and older before the actual numbers start dying. Japan has had a below replacement birth rate since 1964. They legalized abortion back in 1954, and for the last 25 years they've been averaging about 1.3 children. And so the Japanese population will be shrinking faster and faster from now on. Japan has another problem, of course. It's a series of islands. They don't like immigrants very much in Japan, so they can't solve their problem through immigration. They're very advanced in robotics because they don't have enough workers on the assembly line. And in fact, they're now making little robots to look like little kids. And so if you're an elderly person with no grandchildren, you can buy a little robot that looks like a human being, a little boy or a little girl, who will talk to you and say, Grandpa, say things like, Grandpa, why is the sky blue? And Grandpa, how do birds fly? And you can pretend for a while that you actually have a grandchild. The other thing they're doing in Japan is they have rent-a-families, that elderly Japanese with no children can rent a young couple with 1 or 2 children for the weekend and pretend for 72 hours that they're actually grandparents. So the human face of these dying societies is sad. And the other point that was made in the video is, yeah, there are some people who are going to decide not to have children. Fine. If they think there's a population problem and they want to solve the problem by being voluntarily sterilizing themselves or being infertile, let them. But the rest of us have to make up for that lapse, right? And it doesn't take everybody in a population to have a large family. If you just have 5 or 10% of the population who are generous in having children, they can replace the rest of the population. So if somebody says to you, there's an overpopulation problem, say to them, are you part of the problem? And if they say no, ask them, why not? How do you know you're not part of the problem? And if they still believe there's an overpopulation problem, tell them they can solve it by voluntarily joining the voluntary human extinction movement. There actually is a voluntary human extinction movement. But don't try to get the rest of us to follow you down the path to extinction, because we're not going. Let's go to the next one. Now I have to tell you guys that Colin, who's down there minding the camera, was one of the 2 geniuses who put these things together. I'm sure you. And he is very, very gratified by your response, because, you know, it's one thing to see the numbers go up on the YouTube video views. We have hundreds of thousands of views of these things, but it's another thing to have a live audience applauding. So. So fortunately, we're recording this, so you can take it back and play it for Joseph as well. So a couple of things to add to that. We have enough food. We can produce enough food using current agricultural technology to feed 12 billion people. How many people do we have on the planet now? Close to 7. We're going to pass 7 at the end of this year, and I guarantee that as we get close to 7 billion, you will see a vast outpouring of propaganda talking about how overpopulated the world is and how it's causing famine and starvation in different parts of the world, because they always use these milestones as excuses to propagate the myth of overpopulation. But what we need to keep in mind is that we may pass 7 billion at the end of the year, but it's going to be a long time before we get to 8 billion, and the world's population is going to peak at around 8 billion or so in 30 years, and then it's going to begin to decline. And so we're going to be out, we're going to do a little campaign of our own towards the end of the year to welcome baby 6 billion into the world, because every human being is an asset. Every human being is a valuable member of the human family. One of the things that we've done is we've calculated what the economists call the present future value of a baby born in the United States. And of course, it's like buying a bond that you buy over the course of 20 years and then begins to produce income over the next 50 years, like a child growing up, going to college, and then going off and getting a job and paying their parents back for their college tuition, right? You're all going to do that. Going off and getting a job for the next 50 years. What would the value today of that bond be? What would the value today be of a baby born in the United States? And the numbers that we got were about $2/3 And so every baby born is worth a small fortune over his or her lifetime. That's what they will contribute. That's what they will produce more than they will consume. And to turn it around, every baby aborted is the death of a small fortune. Every baby aborted makes us all poor. Now we don't oppose abortion, because of dollars and cents calculations. But there are people who won't listen to arguments based on morality and ethics, and who need to know that if you do a cost-benefit analysis, you're making us all poorer by aborting over 1 million unborn Americans each year. And you can crunch the numbers for India, you can crunch the numbers for China as well, and it turns out that every baby aborted in India and China is also makes that society poor. Not by $600,000 in China, I think the numbers are $3,000 or $4,000 today. But this is an economic disaster as well as being a moral one. So let's go to the next one. So this is a fundamental question. You know, how do you eliminate poverty? I mean, we'd all like to see people around the world better off. And for the last 50 years, our government, through our foreign aid agency, has answered that question in part by saying, well, we eliminate poverty by eliminating the poor and their children. And so we are out today spending $1 billion a year shipping abortion equipment and abortifacient contraceptives, promoting abortion overseas in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, all in order to reduce the number of children born. When we should be out there promoting what? We should be out there promoting the rule of law, encouraging the protection of private property, encouraging governments to promote business, to encourage entrepreneurial activity, because it's private enterprise and the free market that is the greatest wealth generator that the world has ever known. But there are two ways of looking at the problem. You know, one way of looking at the problem is to say, okay, we've got 10 seats at the table, and if number 11 comes along, we don't want him, we want to eliminate him because the table is already set. And the other way of looking at it is to say, no, we can set as big a banquet table for humanity as we are capable of, and we should do it. And so we should set extra places at the table. And actually, if we take the latter view, the more places you have at the table, the better it is for all of us. Because as the YouTube video said, as our numbers have grown, our prosperity has grown even further. The guys wouldn't let me put a lot of statistics in it because they say it bores people, but let me bore you for a second by telling you that we had you know, the population of the world in 1800 was about 1 billion people, you know, less than 1/6 of what we have today. And the per capita income worldwide was about $100. Well, by 1927, we passed 2 billion, and the per capita income was $500. So we doubled the world's population, but we quintupled the per capita income worldwide. We passed 3 billion in 1960. Per capita income was up to 1,500. So we added another billion, another 50%, but per capita income tripled. We passed 6 billion in 2000, and per capita income is now $5,000 and keeps going up. So as our numbers have grown, our prosperity has grown even faster. And you know, if you think about it, it only makes sense because the more people you have, the more creative intelligences you have to put to work on problems, the more hands you have to work producing goods. I mean, you probably all seen the numbers of what we have eliminated, the kinds of people we've eliminated from our society by having all these tens of millions of abortions. Think of how many millions of doctors and accountants and nurses and teachers we've eliminated from our midst by having abortion on demand. Think of how many businesses didn't get started, how many schools didn't get built, because we don't have the people either to build them or the people to consume them. So we have to get rid of the mindset that people are just consumers, that people are just kind of the mindset of the radical environmentalists that the people are just sort of parasites on the earth, that we're breeding ourselves off the face of the planet, and we're extinguishing, you know, thousands of other species in the process. The fact is that as our numbers have grown, our prosperity has grown, and we become more able to take care of the environment. This seems counterintuitive, right? That the more people you have, the better able you would be to take care of the environment. But the logic goes like this: the more people you have, the more wealth you create, and as you get wealthier, you can afford to set aside money for to build national parks, to set aside nature preserves, to let land go fallow. The wealthier you get, the more people tend to be concentrated in cities, and the more the countryside empties out. You've got I don't know if there's anyone here from the Dakotas, North Dakota, South Dakota, yeah? Your state governments are advertising for people to come to those states. As you know, there are too few people in the Dakotas. And it's not any colder there than it is here, right? Not today anyway. So you see cross-culturally, internationally, that as countries grow up to reach about $3,000 in per capita income, they begin to set aside money to protect the environment. They build wastewater treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, and they clean up the mess that's made by their numbers. And at the end of the day, you've got a cleaner environment than you started with. It's really poverty. We haven't done this video yet, I'm sorry, or I'd show you, but the next video is to talk about how poverty destroys the environment. You know, it's the very poor who cut down the last tree because they need it for fuel or to heat their homes. It's the very poor who pollute the very water they need to drink because they don't have the wherewithal to build a wastewater treatment plant. It's the very poor who plant the last square foot of land for food because they're always hungry. So it's poverty that devastates the environment, and wealth enables you to clean up the problems that poverty creates, that human numbers create.